Hello, my name's Alice. I'm an F1 at Sandwell City, and this mini lecture is on child protection, safeguarding, and then the ethical and legal issues associated with gum. So by the end of this session, you should be able to briefly discuss the main forms of child abuse and have an awareness of how to identify them, and then have an awareness of your role as a doctor in safeguarding children and young people. You should have a broad knowledge of the law surrounding consent and refusal of treatment in children and young people, and then you should be able to understand the relevance of this knowledge in the context of provision of sexual health services for young people. So we're going to go over a brief overview of child abuse and how to recognise it, that your responsibility as a doctor in safeguarding young people and the importance of multi-agency working. I'm going to go over consent in children and young people, and then we're going to briefly touch on disclosure of serious communicable disease in a gum clinic and consenting to HIV testing. So abuse. So we're going to go through the main types of child abuse and the key signs to recognise them. So the first kind of child abuse that we're going to think about is physical abuse. So this is probably the most self-explanatory, and it can include things like hitting, slapping, punching, kicking, shaking, burning, poisoning, but also fabricated or induced illness, which used to be known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where parents will or caregivers will fabricate an illness or make their child become ill so that they can then seek medical attention. Key features or things that would make you worry about a child and whether they were being abused would be recurrent presentations with various injuries. And then when you take that history, the history isn't really consistent with the injuries they're presenting with, or the story can be quite vague. And then injuries that aren't consistent with the developmental stage of a child. So as a general rule, if a child can't move, it can't hurt itself. So small babies that just lie there shouldn't really have any bruises or injuries at all. And then also bruises on places where children don't usually hurt themselves. So if a small toddler is walking around the house and bumping into things, they'll have bruises on their legs, on their bony prominences. But if the child has bruises on ears or their neck or their back or their bottom, that's unusual and not consistent with that child's developmental stage. Also things like bite marks, or if injuries are in a suspicious shape, consistent with being slapped or hit with an object, or burns, all those sorts of things would raise red flags. Risk factors for physical abuse are important to think about. It doesn't mean that any particular group of people are definitely abusing their children, and neither does it mean that if you don't meet any of these criteria, you can't be abusing your children, because child abuse can happen in every part of society. But risk factors include poverty, mental health disorders in parents, drug or alcohol misuse in parents, a family where there's domestic abuse going on as well. If the parents have a history of child abuse or neglect, that can often continue into the next generation. Or if the family are isolated or relationships are breaking down. And then poor housing is also a risk factor. The second kind of abuse we're going to consider is emotional abuse. So this can consist of things like humiliation, constant criticism, threatening a child, excessive control of a child being exposed to upsetting events. So if they're witnessing domestic abuse, or if they're witnessing their parents taking drugs, ignoring a child, or withholding the positive things that a child needs to thrive. So it's not always negative things, but if you don't praise that child and give them the positive regard and encouragement that they need, that's also emotional abuse. And typical signs of emotional abuse can depend on the age of the child, but include things like poor confidence, and an inability to control your own emotions or big emotional outbursts. Difficult relationships, so struggling to build and maintain relationships with friends, or cold and distant relationships with their parents. And then age, inappropriate behaviour and language if they've been exposed to things that you wouldn't expect someone of that age to be exposed to. Sexual abuse is when a child is forced to take part in sexual activities, so that can involve physical contact with the abuser, it can not involve contact with the abuser, and it can be in person or online. And it can include forcing children to take part in sexual activity, or even just encouraging them to do so, rape, inappropriately touching children, and then forcing children to watch sexual acts or pornography. And also you can be aware of child sexual exploitation, so that's if you exploit a child for money or power or status. So signs of sexual abuse include physical signs that they've been abused, so bruising, bleeding, STIs and pregnancy in women or girls. If the child is particularly fearful of someone in particular, if they're having nightmares or bedwetting, if they allude to having secrets that they're not allowed to tell anyone, that's always a worrying sign. And if their behaviour is overly sexualised in a way that's not age appropriate. And then also there's more sort of mental health presentations to this, so they might develop an eating disorder, they might self-harm, or they might run away from home to escape the abuse. So the risk factors for sexual abuse include children experiencing other forms of abuse, so they're much more likely to also be sexually abused, disability, and girls aged 15 to 17 are particularly at risk. The fourth main kind of abuse we're going to think about is neglect. So this is where the parent doesn't provide for the needs of the child. So this can include physical neglect, so not providing appropriate food or clothing or shelter or a safe environment for that child. Educational neglect, so not ensuring that that child's educational needs are met, so either ensuring that they get to school or whatever alternative education is in place. Emotional neglect, so each child has a need for love and nurture and relationships, and if you don't fulfill that need, that's emotional neglect. And then medical neglect, so if you don't seek appropriate medical and dental care for your child when they need it. Signs of neglect include an unkempt child, so if they're smelly or dirty because they haven't been washed, if they're dressed inappropriately for the weather, if they don't have money or food with them for lunch, or they've not been fed. And they can often have poor health, so lots of accidental injuries because they're not being supervised. In smaller children, things like nappy rash, and then if they're not getting good dental care, they can have poor dental health as well. You might also notice behaviour changes in children. And risk factors for neglect include disability, includes children who are born prematurely who have a very low birth weight, if they have lots of complex health needs that make them more difficult to care for, children in care, and then asylum seekers are also more at risk. So in general, signs that a child is being abused, we're going to have a think about those. These aren't specific to any one particular type of abuse, they're just things to be aware of. So if a child that you know has a particular change in their behaviour or personality, so they could become more withdrawn, they could become more anxious or aggressive, those are things that make you worried that something's going on with that child. If their relationship with the parent or caregiver is quite poor, that might also make you worried that something's going on there. Children running away is a red flag. And then if they're aware and talking about things which are not age appropriate for them, for example, sort of small children being aware of sexual issues, that would also be concerning. And also, especially an older child who has more choice over what they wear, if they're wearing clothes that are very covering, obviously some children might just choose to wear those clothes, but that could also be worrying that they're trying to cover themselves up. So just having a think about safeguarding. I'm sure you'll get lots of statutory teaching on safeguarding every time you move trust, but just having a think about the GMC guidance. So it states that as doctors we must be aware of risk factors for abuse and be on the lookout for signs of abuse in children. So even if you're looking after adults, you've still got to be aware that they may be a risk to the children in their lives. And if you're concerned about a child, or if you're not sure if you should be concerned about a child, then it's your responsibility to raise that. And usually as a doctor, unless you're the safeguarding lead, you'll just raise that with your safeguarding lead or your senior, so your consultant. So just discuss that with someone. And we have a professional duty to raise concerns if you think a child's at risk of abuse or neglect. If you do want to raise concerns, I mean, obviously you can discuss it informally in your team first, but if you're going to inform social services, then you need to inform the parents that you're going to do so, unless you think this is going to pose a risk to yourself or to the child because you think that might trigger more abuse. But you don't need their consent, you just need to let them know. And importantly, in your role as a junior doctor, you don't need to be investigating the abuse or examining the child. So that's a specialist role. And just to quickly go over the importance of multi-agency working. So many agencies can be involved in a child, and each one will have a slightly different insight into what's going on with that child. So police might be involved potentially, Obviously that child will be involved with various teachers and staff at school. Health visitors might be involved if that child's vulnerable. GP might be aware of them. They might come into you in hospital, in ED and other places in secondary care. Then also children's services and social services, and possibly organisations in the voluntary sector. And each of those organisations might have a different insight and a different set of information about what's going on with that child. So the key point here really is that it's essential to have good communication between the various sectors to get a fuller picture of what's happening with a child. This isn't usually your responsibility as a doctor. It'll be coordinated by social services, but it's just really important to have that communication going. So then, having a think about a child's capacity to consent to treatment. So from age 16, we presume that children have capacity to consent. So if they consent, that consent is valid, unless you're concerned about their capacity. Under 16, they may well have capacity to consent, but this depends on their ability to understand and weigh up their options. This is a bit like the adult law on mental capacity. And it's not dependent on age particularly, but it will depend on how complex the decision is. So a child may be able to consent to a simple decision where it's easy to understand the options, but may not be able to consent to a more serious decision with more life-changing consequences. And if that child is deemed competent to consent, the parents cannot really override this. If the child doesn't have capacity to consent, then parental consent is adequate. If two parents disagree at this point, it gets a bit too complicated and you'll probably need to seek legal advice or advice from your senior or advice from a defence union. And that'll apply up to the age of 18 in England and Wales. Children over 16 in Scotland are actually treated as adults, so you'll just treat them as per the Mental Capacity Act. So children refusing consent is a really complex area. Even the GMC acknowledges that the law is complicated, and your team will probably end up seeking legal advice. You need to be able to weigh up the harms of overriding the refusal of a competent child against the benefits of treating them. So you'll likely involve an MDT and then get legal advice. So we're going to have a think about Gillick and Fraser competence. So this follows from a case. So a lady called Gillick went to court to seek assurance that her 5 children under the age of 16 would not be offered contraception without her knowledge. So that's why it's known as Gillick competence. It's also known as Fraser competence because that was the name of the judge that ruled. And this got batted back between various appeal courts for a while, and then it resulted in the Fraser guidelines, which are used if you're prescribing contraception to under 16s, but also are used more broadly for sort of consenting under 16s to treatment. So you can prescribe contraception to a girl under the age of 16 if you're certain that the young person understands the advice and can understand what's going on. If you can't persuade them to inform their parents or to let you inform their parents, and that they're going to have sex regardless of whether you give them contraception or not. Without contraception, that their physical or mental health would suffer. I think that's fairly straightforward because obviously the risk of pregnancy and STIs are quite significant, and then that it would be in their best interest to give them that treatment without parental consent. So as long as those are met, you can prescribe contraception to under 16s without informing their parents. And then having you think about the relevance of this in sexual health services for under 16s. So it's important that sexual health services for under 16s are confidential, otherwise people are unlikely to access them. So the risks of pregnancy and STIs are obviously still there in under 16s, and you can provide contraception and advice on STIs to anyone under the age of 16 without breaching confidentiality. The only reason you'd want to breach confidentiality is to protect them. So if, for example, you're concerned about abuse, you can then raise that with the appropriate authorities. Just to be clear about consent for sex, so the age of consent is 16, but that law is aimed to prevent exploitation of children under 16 rather than to prosecute people under 16 who are having mutually consensual sex. So that's the emphasis of the law. If a child under 13 is considered to be having sexual contact, that needs to be reported, because a child under the age of 13 is unable to consent in law, so that would just be statutory rape. So now we're going to briefly consider some other ethical issues in genitourinary medicine. So the first is disclosure of sexually transmitted infections. So this is if you're treating a patient with serious communicable disease. So in a sexually transmitted infections, that could include HIV or hepatitis A or B, but also things like TB. But that's not sexually transmitted, obviously. So if you're treating someone who has a serious communicable disease, you need to explain to them how they can protect others. So if it's sexually transmitted, things like barrier methods of contraception, so condoms, and that they should inform their sexual partners of the risk of transmission before sex. And then if you don't think they're going to inform their partner, you can disclose to a sexual partner if you believe that the partner is at risk of infection, which could result in serious harm. And then if you cannot persuade that patient to inform them, then you are allowed to disclose. You do need to tell the patient before you disclose it. And in general then, if you are contact tracing for that patient, so if they've told you they're sexual partners and you are tracing them to inform that they should come in for testing, you should not be disclosing the identity of that patient in that case. And then just to go over consent for HIV testing, so you do need to gain consent from a patient before you test them for HIV. You should explain the benefits of testing. So if they get a diagnosis of HIV, that allows them to get early treatment, and there might be other benefits specific to that patient. And then you need to explain to them how they're going to get those results. So whether you're going to follow them up face-to-face or how they'll receive them. And if they refuse that, you should document that. And as long as they consent, that's absolutely fine, and you can go ahead and test them for HIV. So these are the references. GMC guidance is actually often fairly dry, but actually quite useful when it comes to sort of safeguarding and ethical guidance for the under 18s. And the NSPCC learning site is actually really useful as well if you're looking at sort of abuse and child protection. Thank you for listening.